Well, I'd like first, my name is Amy Vu. I'd like to thank you for taking the time out this Monday evening to join us in a webinar on the impact of racialized policies on education and educational practice with Dr. Matais Pouncil. And our agenda today is brief welcome, so welcome. And then I will introduce tonight's speaker. Then Matais is going to take over and talk about his experiences. He's got some great videos also, and we'll have a discussion at the end. We'll also take questions from the audience and close out before 8:30. Some of the webinar suggestions, there's some etiquette that I'm going to go over. Please keep yourself muted during the webinar. Also, if you have questions, if during the session you think of questions or you have comments, you feel free to type it in chat. And if we don't get it answered during the session, then it will get compiled at the end and asked, and we'll go through that at the end. So Dr. Matais Pouncil is not just a great human being, because he is a very great human being, but he is a very experienced educational professional. He's worked in the California community colleges, the California State University system, and the UC systems. One of the few people that I know that has worked in all three systems, right? He has not only served as a faculty member, but has had various administrative roles throughout the years. And so you can see by his bio here, which I am not going to read all the way through because it's lengthy, and I will let Matais tell you about himself, right? But he has extensive experience in education. So with that, I am going to pass this over to Dr. Matais Pouncil.
Thank you, Amy Vu, my pleasure. Good evening, friends, colleagues, League of Women Voter supporters, members, etc. The pleasure is all mine. Very happy to be here this evening for this, for this conversation about racialized policies on education and educational practice. A report of a lived experience. Looks like we've got a pretty intimate room of 10 people. And so if you don't mind, I will sort of switch it up a bit and be a bit eclectic in this presentation so that we can learn each other, learn perspectives, opinions, politics, more of a colloquium series, a dialogue, a discourse. I think that will perhaps be a bit more rich for all of us, right? Okay, so I thought I switched up a bit as opposed to having a presentation about colleges and universities, their practices, policies, and institutional structures, and how they may contribute to disproportionate outcomes. I thought the better of that, as opposed to providing citation after citation about how colleges and universities for decades have been centers for cultural, class, and socioeconomic reproductions and replacement. I thought the better of it, how Black and other minoritized students struggle in school settings, colleges and university environments with academic completion, engagement, access dilemmas, and outcome percentages. I didn't want to go through all of that literature and all of that data. Finally, it occurred to me to talk about the California Education Master Plan, which was established in 1960 to organize educational outcomes for California citizens and for California's post-secondary higher education institutions. The point of the master plan was to formally stratify our state's post-secondary institutions into three domains: the University of California, the California State University, and California Community College systems. While on the surface, this master plan appears to support the educational demands and aspirations of California citizens, and it does, it also foretells many of the hardships, triumphs, and struggles of our state's racial, economic, and immigrant groups. The three systems are mostly racially and socioculturally homogeneous, with very little diversity or effective racial justice policies that advance the educational goals of most of the state's racialized groups. But again, I thought the better of it and opted not to make a quantitative presentation with pie charts and graphs and bar metrics, because that feels impersonal. It feels ineffective and unnecessary. Quite frankly, I think you may have a general sense of how dire the straits are in California and in the US for many persons of color, immigrants, income lowered populations. And if you don't have a good sense of that, I'm happy to send over reports, articles, and studies, and I will do that. Instead, this evening, I'd like to make the space smaller and share a bit about my own educational, professional, and familial journey as an educator, hence the lived experience piece in the title. I can provide an exemplar of who the educational leaders are in our state's post-secondary systems. My journey may be unique, it may be interesting, it may be informative, but it will likely motivate the conversation so that we each can learn a bit more about education through the lived experience of an educator, right? An educational practice that may be generalizable. Okay, so that's sort of like the frame of this dialogue that I hope to engage in, that I hope that we will engage in. It's 10 of us. Okay, so I'll share a bit about my biography to make the space more intimate. I then would like to talk about race. I'd like to have a dialogue, get your thoughts about relevant statements, share a couple of videos, and learn reactions to the statements and to the videos, your notions, your ideas. This is indeed a safe space. I've got quite a bit of experience facilitating these kinds of conversations that can potentially be thick, but I got you. And I think we can have an intelligent discourse on the topic. I'd also like to respond to questions related to my lived experience as an educator, as an African-American man, as a queer man, as an educated man that is 6'7", that is dark-hued, and how I show up in educational spaces, right, and in life, and how all of those sort of identities come to bear on my work practice and my educational practice, okay? So the autobiography. My educational background was shared in the introduction, but I attended Southern University, an historically Black college in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I graduated with a degree in economics there in that space. I went on to attend California State University, Long Beach, and I earned the Master's of Social and Multicultural Foundations at Cal State Long Beach. And then I enrolled in the EDD program at the University of California, Irvine, and earned the degree in educational leadership and administration with an emphasis on community college education. Okay, so that's sort of like my educational background. That's my educational stuff. Not exciting, I know. What is perhaps more interesting is that I am from Kansas City, Missouri. So I'm from the Midwest originally. My brother and I attended Catholic schools in the Midwest. My parents separated, and my mother, my brother, and I moved to Oakland when I was 10 years old. So I graduated from the Oakland public schools. My brother and I are 19 months apart, and he is serving a life sentence in prison. He's been incarcerated for 30 years. He's married, and I've learned much about prison life and prison culture, supporting him on his journey. I am an ally to incarcerated persons. I'm an advocate for prison reform because of my relationship with my brother. There are successful inmate education programs at California community colleges that I advocate for, that I support, that I help write grants for, because of my sort of intimate awareness of some of the needs of incarcerated persons. For 30 years, I visited prisons, put money on the books, accepted collect calls, sent packages, and written letters. I've been to 3 continents, 4 African countries, 42 of the US states. I'm a Pisces. My dad is deceased, and my mom has been married for 17 years to a lovely woman. I identify as African American because it's popular. I identify as Black American because it's accurate. And I know that above all, I am an American. I'm reminded of that important identity and nationality when I travel abroad. And I also come from a very service-oriented family. Both of my parents served in the military. Both of my grandfathers served in the military. I have first cousins and aunts and uncles who were career military. So I come from a very service-oriented family. And so while I appreciate the hyphenated identity, I'm very clear and very proud of my American identity. I did not serve in the military, but I got this flag, sort of flying outside of my house in major sort of patriotism. And I want to thank those of you who are among us here who have served. Thank you for your service, and thank you for protecting our liberties. So that is a bit of autobiography that I've shared, some educational background, a bit about myself. I do see Amy in the room. I see Joshua in the room. Lois, thank you for being here. Christine, Sophia, Marianne, Ali, Francis, and Dulce. The pleasure is all mine. So I've done that to make the space smaller so that we can have a dialogue about race with an educator, a person with academic training on the topic that can likely help us reflect on our thinking, our perspectives, our opinions, our thinking, our perspectives, and our opinions. Okay, I want to share a video, the first video that will motivate our conversation this evening. I've invited Toni Morrison to be sort of like our scholar in residence. What I'd like for us to do is just sort of listen to some of her comments, her perspective, think about it, perhaps take notes, because I would like to engage us in a dialogue. There are 2 videos, and then we have some prompts that we can respond to. Okay, all right, first video is Toni Morrison being interviewed by Charlie Rose, and she makes, I think, some pretty relevant and salient points for us to digest this evening related to race, culture, and education.
Warriors, I think. once asked you the question, can you imagine writing a novel that's not centered about race? And you said, absolutely.
Yes,
Will you?
that's what he asked me. I think, see, I answered the question he didn't pose. You know, Tolstoy writes about race
Yeah.
all the time. So does Zola, so does James Joyce. Now, if anybody can go up to an imaginary James Joyce and say, you write about race all the time. It's central in your novels. When are you going to write about what? Because you see, the person who asks that question doesn't understand that he or she is also raced. So to ask me when am I going to stop, or when, if I can, is to ask a question that, in a sense, is its own answer. Yes, I can write about white people. White people can write about black people. Anything can happen in art. There are no boundaries there. Having to do it or having to prove that I can do it is what was embarrassing or insulting. In this book, I did.
It was insulting that people, help me understand, what was insulting? The idea that you felt like you had to prove that you could write without...
Yeah, the question was posed as though it were a desirable thing to do,
Right.
to write about white people or to write not about race. That's what that means to
Right.
me. And that it was a difficult thing to do, a higher level of artistic endeavor, or it was more important, and that I was still writing about marginal people, and why don't I come into the mainstream?
Aren't you importing too much into the question?
Maybe.
I think so.
Well, what else could it be, Charlie? What does that mean? What does that question mean? You tell me if I'm making too much.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I don't think it probably means, I didn't ask the question, so I don't think it probably means, but I don't think it had to do about you were marginalizing by not writing about.
It only works if I can go to William Styron, well, maybe not William Styron because he has done it, somebody major, white, and say, as a journalist.
Can you write about black people?
That's right. Can I say that? What kind of question is that to put to Ed Doctorow, who has done it, by the way?
Sure.
But I mean, if I can say, when are you going to write about black people to a white writer, if that's a legitimate question to a white writer, then it is a legitimate question to me. I just don't think it is. You know, so the glove has to be pulled inside out. If it's, in other words, it's not a literary question. It has nothing to do with the literary imagination. It's a sociological question that should not be put to me. I couldn't ask that of any writer who was, you know, I wouldn't ask it of a black writer when you're going to write about white people. Now, maybe I'm wrong. You can tell me now or later if I've blown it up all out of proportion. I don't think so. I just don't know what the question means except what I think it means. You think it may just be a little question, a little curious, you know, small incidental question. When are you gonna? Maybe I'm responding because I have had reviews in the past that have accused me of not writing about white people. I remember a review of Sula in which the reviewer said, this is all well and good, but one day she, meaning me, will have to face up to the real responsibilities and get mature and write about the real confrontation for black people, which is white people. As though our lives have no meaning and no depth without the white gaze. And I've spent my entire writing life trying to make sure that the white gaze was not the dominant one in any of my books. And the people who helped me most arrive at that kind of language were African writers. Chinua Achebe, Bessie Head. Those writers who could assume the centrality of their race because they were Africans. And they didn't explain anything to white people. Those questions were incomprehensible to them. Those questions that I would have as a minority living in an all-white country like the United States. But when I read the poetry of Cesar, or the poetry of Senghor, or the novels particularly, Things Fall Apart was more important to me than anything. Only because there was a language, there was a posture, there were the parameters. I could step in now, and I didn't have to be consumed by or be concerned by the white gaze. That was the liberation for me. It has nothing to do with who reads the books. Everyone, I hope, of any race, any gender, any country. But my sovereignty and my authority as a racialized person had to be struck immediately with the very first book. And it was strange because in this country, many books, particularly then, 40s, 50s, you could feel the address of the narrator over my shoulder, talking to somebody else, talking to somebody white. I could tell because they're explaining things that they didn't have to explain if they were talking to me. It was that. So it's profound for me. So that I may be, you may be right, maybe I'm over-dramatizing the whole question, which was innocent enough because the problem of being free to write the way you wish to without this other racialized gaze is a serious one for an African-American writer. Very serious.
I think this is one of those times where what you just said, you gave and ennobled an answer, regardless of the significance
Well, that's good.
of the question.
Thank you,
More
Amy, for sharing that. I'd like to just sort of unpack that a bit. If you can stop sharing screen, if I can see our attendees here. So Morrison, Pulitzer Prize winning writer, scholar, professor at Princeton University, passed away a few years ago, describes her writing career, writing about race, writing centrally about Black folk, and then being asked the question by journalists, when are you going to enter the mainstream and write about white people? And she was interrupting that question because as she responded, can you ask a major, legitimate white writer, when are they going to write about Black people? As a way of legitimizing their craft or their art. Since I'm having a conversation this evening with the League of Women Voters, imagine a woman writer spending her entire career centralizing women's issues, raising women's concerns, political advances, gender topics, raising those out, calling those to the fore, right? And then being asked, you're writing about women, but when are you going to write about men, right? As if writing about men is a more difficult or smarter endeavor, right? Or a more enterprising, difficult task, right? So if we put her response in a gendered context, right, it becomes a bit more clearer how troublesome that question is and can be received from a person, in this case, a Black person, who is writing centrally about race, right? Any reactions to that video? Any thoughts, initial thoughts? No right or wrong, How does it land on the ears? Any reactions at all?
Charlie Rose didn't get it.
Charlie Rose did not get it. Yeah, you know, there are so many videos on YouTube with Toni Morrison, particularly, and Charlie Rose. Charlie Rose, in fact, was her favorite journalist and the person who she was most comfortable outside of the academy and academics engaging in interviews. And so like they had this, you can tell, you know, she's calling her by his name, but you know, Charlie, you know, she's like, it's intimate, right, for them. And so I don't know if he didn't get it or not, or if he was just sort of probing, right, and sincerely wanting more of a response from Morrison. But yeah, I thought his questions were spot on. I thought the way he probed was spot on because it gave us, right, elicited the kind of response that she provided. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Any other initial thoughts? I see a hand by Ali.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
I thought what she had to say rang so true that it made me sad, because it seemed to one of the underlying currents seemed to be that writing about white people would be the same as not writing about race, as if you know, you're only racialized if you're Black. If you're white, that's the default race. So that's writing about white people would be not writing about race. You know, it's writing about the race that we don't see, that we ought to be seeing as well. So I guess that made me sad, but I think Charlie Rose vindicated himself a little bit at the end. And I'm just paraphrasing here, but when he said she gave a big answer to a puny question.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's amazing to listen to just as much as she is to read.
Totally. Yeah, he sort of redeemed himself. You ennobled a question, right? But you're spot on. You're spot on, Ali. And Toni Morrison mentions that, like, white, as if there are only the only races are non-white. But in fact, to be white is also a race. So to ask a person not to write about race is to ask a person not to write about themselves, right? But we are, in fact, and that's where that language racialized comes from, right? The other video that we will view talks about race as a construct and racism and its functions and its commodity. So I appreciate you motivating the conversation, Ali. Thanks for that contribution. I see Christine in the chat here. We write about what we know. Thank goodness Black writers write about being Black, so those of us who are white learn something. Thank you, Christine. We got Joshua in here. I thought that her answer was quite informative. She answers the question with such ease. It clearly states the ignorance that some may have. You're spot on, Joshua. You're spot on. If I can, are there others? Are there others? No? Okay. If I can share, we're gonna go a little deeper. We're gonna go a little deeper with our scholar in residence, Toni Morrison, and share another video that unpacks the sentiment of the first interview a bit deeper, okay? The second video, please. There you go.
As race, it's just a human race.
Can we start
Scientifically,
that from the beginning, please?
anthropologically,
Amy?
racism is a construct.
There you go. Thank you so much.
There is no such thing as race. There's just a human race. Scientifically, anthropologically, racism is a construct, a social construct. I take your race away, and there you are, all strung out, and all you got is your little self. And what is that? What are you without racism? If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem.
You don't think you will ever change and write books that incorporate white lives into them substantially?
I have done.
In a substantial way?
You can't understand how powerfully racist that question is, can you? Because you could never ask a white author, when are you going to write about black people? Even the inquiry comes from a position of being in the center and being used to being in the center.
Thank you. Even the inquiry comes from a place of being in the center and being accustomed to being in the center, being in the center. Okay, just to wet our whistle a little bit with those contributions from Toni Morrison, those contributions. I have some questions here I'd like to pose for this community gathered. We were going to do breakout sessions, but because this is such an intimate group here, I'd like to pose them in this larger group. And if you can stop share screen there, please, I can see our friends. Okay, and I'm going to go here to my view gallery. Perfection. Okay, cool. All right. First question for us to sort of consider and reflect on is, when you know a person's race, what do you know about them? When we know a person's race, what do we know about them? Thank you, Amy, for putting that in the chat for those who are like visual learners there. We know a person's race, what do we know? Toni Morrison says, well, when we know a person's gender, when we know a person's gender, what do we know? What do we know about that person when we know their gender? You got it, Ali.
I'm too lazy to put it in the chat. Sorry, I didn't get to it. We know all the stereotypes about that person.
Ah, there you go. There you go. You're spot on. You're spot on. We know the stereotypes and we know the baggage, right? But we don't know that person. We don't know that person. Okay. And that is another, sort of question that Morrison has posed. When you know a person's race, what do you know? Essentially nothing. Essentially nothing. Likewise with gender. If I know your gender, do I know how you want to wear your hair? Do I know your physical strengths and limitations? Do I know your academic capacity? Do I know your professional capacity, right? Do I know your interest? Okay, do I know where you prefer to live if I know your gender? Okay, so similarly in race, in a racialized context, when we know a person's race, we don't really know much other than the stereotypical information and the baggage that comes with that. Or the compliments, or the beautifulness, right? Or the pride, or the glory, right? I want to keep it in a positive, right, context, and not a deficit model. But what I am saying is that race, like gender, like immigrant status, like language acquisition, are or can be peripheral, tangential, not meaningful when it comes to knowing a person, an individual, a personality, right? Okay, so thank you, Ali, for motivating the conversation and for contributing in that way. Any other perspectives? Okay, next question here. What difference does difference make? What difference does difference make? Does difference make a difference? Racially, culturally, immigrant status, gender, language. Joshua says diversity of thought. What difference does difference make? Diversity of thought, absolutely. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Joshua. Okay, just like if there's another one in there I want to get to. What difference? Okay, no, that was the question there. What difference? Okay. I would posit that difference, Christine says, makes life more interesting. Absolutely. Makes life more spicy, more interesting, more flavorful, more expansive, wider, eclectic. Difference makes all those things. You know why? Because that's how we are evaluating it, right? The difference that difference makes depends on you, me, our perspective, our evaluation, our perspective, our evaluation. Difference in and of itself is sexy, interesting, fun, eclectic. But when we evaluate difference as a deficit model, or we evaluate difference or gender as othering or marginalizing, then we get into, really sort of unfortunate territory. Difference in and of itself can be amazing and extraordinary. It depends on our evaluation, our construct, right? Our construct of difference. Amy says difference also brings misunderstandings because we tend to look at everything through our own perspective, right? Difference also brings a perspective because we tend to look at things through our own perspective, right? So there is a prism, there is a lens that each of us sort of brings to a situation, a classroom, a Zoom session, a family construct, a reception. We all bring into a space our isms, our stuff, our limited perspectives, or our wide perspectives. Ali says dealing with difference can also be uncomfortable, which I guess is what makes it interesting too. Absolutely, absolutely. And this idea of discomfort, I'd like to, sort of treat that, for a moment, right? So many populations have been uncomfortable, right? Jews in this country have been uncomfortable. Women in this country have been uncomfortable. Catholics have been uncomfortable. Native Americans have been uncomfortable. Black folk have been uncomfortable. Immigrants have been uncomfortable. And we grow from discomfort, right? We grow from areas of discomfort and pain, right? So this idea that we have to avoid it, and I don't hear you saying that at all, Ali, I'm using that to motivate the conversation. This idea that we have to avoid discomfort, I think we really want to sort of reconsider that, because there are times and spaces when it is in fact the discomfort that moves us politically, that moves us ideologically, that moves us intellectually, right? And so I'm actually, sort of looking for, the discomfort. I'm actually looking for the challenge so that I can exercise that intellectual muscle, right? So that I can exercise that that way of thinking and that way of being. Francis, I see you in there. difference may change how we interact with each other. Absolutely, absolutely. I want some of you to elaborate on your comment. Elaborate on your comment. If I can ask you, Francis, what do you mean by that? Difference may change how we interact with each other. Thank you.
Hi. I think I was kind of referring to our stereotypes. Maybe when we don't know people, we only know, the labels. We will have certain assumptions, and then we will, before we know someone, we might think this is how we should communicate with people before we really know who they are. But also, when you were talking about how it makes things interesting is when we actually get to know the people and it breaks the stereotypes. That's really the more interesting relationships that I get.
Totally. Bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Francis. I do that oftentimes with Southern people from the South, right? I make these sweeping generalizations or assumptions about their interest, their ability to cook, right? The ways in which they may talk, or jargons or idioms, right? Their ability to withstand heat in certain temperatures, right? Just way like stuff that, like, Matais, where did you get this? Where are you getting this stuff from? So your point about difference, can determine the way we interact. I mean, the New Yorkers have this, sort of reputation of being a little hard, or being stern, or, sort of shooting from the hip. And I've met, New Yorkers who are so far, sort of from that, sort of stereotype. So certainly we do it geographically. There are ways in which we do it racially. There are ways in which we do it related to gender, and even country of origin, right? Assumptions that we make about folks from different countries. Okay. Thank you, Francis, for motivating that piece there.
Matais,
Yes.
I wanted to respond to what you said about looking for difference and looking for, not difference, for being uncomfortable, for the discomfort. And I think that's coming from a place of safety, maybe privilege, because difference is violence. Difference could be life and death. And I think of a 14-year-old immigrant girl who does not want to be different. She wants to fit in. And sometimes if she doesn't fit in, it means her life. So I just wanted to resound on that issue of difference.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Was that Dulce?
Yes, it is.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Dulce. I totally appreciate that. I honor that contribution. You're spot on, and you're absolutely right. Yeah, my perspective likely comes from a position of privilege, and also the other layer is when I say discomfort, I really mean intellectual discomfort, right? I mean political discomfort or ideological discomfort. Certainly in the example that you mentioned, where a young immigrant girl is uncomfortable or unsafe, that's about physical safety, right? And I want to honor that sort of positionality and that standpoint as well. You're spot on. And there are ways that intellectual comfort and discomfort can be helpful, can also be damaging. I can imagine that as well. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Dulce. Thank you. I'm looking in the chat for other perspectives as well. Okay, good stuff. Thank you, colleagues, for that. I've got a third prompt for us to consider. All right. So we've done, when you know a person's race, what do you know? We've done what difference does difference make? And then finally, an identity, this is a statement and not a question, an identity would seem to be arrived at by the way in which the person faces and uses their experience and identity, right? Would seem to be arrived at by the way in which the person faces and uses their experience. How do you hear that? How do you receive that? Do you agree with that? Do we disagree with that? My thought is I construct my identity as a Black man, in part based on how I am received in society, how society interacts with me, the impositions of society, the celebrations of my identity from society, right? That's an external sort of evaluation. And so my identity may be constructed in part based on that. But certainly I have my own agency, right? And I have my own enterprise, and I have my own personhood, which also informs and constructs my identity as a Black man, okay? Similarly, my identity as a man. I've always not liked that manhood has always been so accessible to menfolk, and masculinity has been always so accessible. Like, if you don't pick up the tab at dinner, you're not a man, right? If you can't change a tire, you're not a man, right? If you don't like sports, oh my God, you're not a man, okay? Or if you like certain colors or certain activities, you're less of a man. That, talk about fragility, right? And talk about, how does manhood become so accessible, right? And destabilizable, right? I've always struggled with that. So manhood, for a lot of folk, I would imagine, there's similar, sort of perspectives in the woman community, right? My identity as a man, right, in some ways is arrived at based on societal impositions, right? But also my identity as a man is based on my own, sort of definitions, my own definition of manhood, and my own sort of calibration of what it means to be a man. I love it. Amy has made a contribution here. I neither agree nor disagree with the statement. My identity, as seen by myself, is constructed. I hear the age. I see I'm reading the agency in there, Amy. My identity, as seen by myself, is constructed by my experience and my education. Okay. However, my identity is also given to me by others. I am often told who I am when I have to check a box. Spot on, spot on. I like the sentence there, but the sentence resonates with me. I am often told who I am. I am often told who I am when I have to check a box. But if we just do it, we are often told who we are, right? And if we don't have the skill set or the experience or the agency or the awareness to reject some of those labels and some of those identities, we can easily and quickly wear those labels and those identities, right? And so part of the message here is to, help others construct healthy identities, and to be aware of how we are allowing others to impose identities on us, right? Okay, thank you, Amy. Are there other perspectives? Other perspectives?
I think much depends on the graciousness of both parties.
Mm-hmm.
Both are open to listening to each other and finding out about each other, because that's what a lot of life is about. And if somebody has a brick or a heavy weight on their shoulder and is not easy to listen to, then there's a very difficult conversation, a difficult time trying to really find out who that person is.
Bless you. Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Marion. You're spot on. I like that. How about that? How about graciousness? Right? Love that introduction of that language to the conversation. Kindness, graciousness, or if you're from my folk, home training, civility, right? In the college context, we often say collegiality, right? But certainly the graciousness, the ability to hear, to your point, Marian, to listen carefully, to understand, and to have a willingness, right? A willingness to understand others, and a desire to be understood. A desire to be, in my professional context, I often say that I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't want to be and in my life, I'm like, I don't want to be, I want to represent myself as accurately as possible. I don't want to be misunderstood because of an email or a facial expression or a response to something that was said. And so I'm thinking before I speak, I'm listening, and I'm providing space and grace for others to do the same. I appreciate that, Miriam. Thanks for checking in. Are there others? Believe it or not, team, it's 7:57. This is a quick and dirty. Tonight with the League of Women Voters. Amy, I want us, if we can, go back to our slide deck, and this will be a time, if we can. I would like to respond to questions that persons may have. I don't always get to ask questions of particular demographics. For example, recently in the media, some of you may have been aware of this, Whoopi Goldberg made some comments about the Jewish community and said that being Jewish is not a race. Is what she said. So there was like all this, sort of hoopla. All right. And so I'm having these discussions with colleagues, with friends, with students. And then it occurred to me, hey, I should probably just ask one of my friends who's Jewish, what do they think? I mean, lose all this intellectual sort of banter, right? But what do my Jewish friends think about that comment, and how do they identify? How do they identify? Okay, all right. I'm using that as a segue because as a Black man here in this space, holding the space, with my educational background, ways to bridge cultural and racial divides. Are there questions that you might have of me, Matais Pouncil, or are there questions that you might have of my demographic, in this space? I would like to bridge some cultural and racial and gender divides that may exist. We've got a few more minutes, and I just want to open it up and have some fun.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I know you can't speak for the African American community, and that's not what I'm suggesting that you do.
Okay.
But I want to know how you feel about at least for 10 years, emerging redefinition of race that is equated with violence, not skin color. So in other words, race is not about skin color, it's simply about power and violence. How do you feel about that? And I'm asking you as a queer Black man.
Don't say. Thank you. I would like to separate violence from race, and that violence is something that is perpetuated evenly, regardless of race. I would like to consider that, and I will. As a Black man, however, I feel like there is a disproportionate amount of violence perpetuated by certain institutional systems on Black men. And I leave room for the violence, for example, that is perpetuated on women, domestic violence, that is perpetuated on children in the way of sex trafficking, the violence that is perpetuated on immigrant communities and cultures, right, at borders, border facilities. So to your point, Dulce, I recognize the spectrum, the spectrum of violence that is enacted on so many communities. And I think it can be also unpacked, right? We can disaggregate the violence, you know. But I love that question for consideration. You know, and probably, you know, if you talk to one demographic, they're going to, you know, sort of call out their particular demographic as being the most, you know, sort of unfortunate when it comes to any particular sort of thing, you know. This sort of like the oppression Olympics, you know. No, I've been oppressed more, or no, I get more violence than you, you know. And so there's that I don't want to move towards, but I also want to recognize that there are different, types and kinds of violence, and certainly Black men are located in a special way also.
Mhm.
How'd I do, Dulce?
I hear you.
Okay.
So I've been a scholar of race
Yes.
and racism for all of my professional life, and I have such difficulty with that emerging redefinition of race and racism. No, it's not about color, it's about power and violence. And I think, how can it not be about color when, if I'm darker than you, I'm considered inferior, or, I get shuffled across the Atlantic Ocean in horrendous situations. I end up in jail more often than anybody else who's lighter skin. How can it not be? I have a difficult time with that, but I also certainly understand that a Jewish person will say, yeah, I'm white, and I'm considered white, but I've been hurt and persecuted, and horrendous atrocities have happened. So that's the trouble for me. Yeah, it's race. That definition is also race and racism. So yeah, thank you for elaborating on that.
Yeah, that's good stuff. That's good stuff. And as you say that, I'm thinking about, race as the construct, right? That as we know it here in the United States, right? And how violence is enacted on certain populations here in the United States. And globally. I can't help, however, but think about the ethnic whites that are engaged in violence right now with Russia and Ukraine, right? I mean, these are white folks fighting white folks, engaged in wars. And in fact, the wars that we know of historically and worldwide in this country and in this world have been waged by white folk, right? I mean, we have domestic violence, black on black crime, and domestic violence in homes and domestic partner violence, etc. But when we talk about wars, the persons who are enacting wars are white people, right? So when we talk about violence, we can talk about it in a sort of local, domestic way, right? Or we can talk about it in a global international setting, right? And so that's when I say we can disaggregate it, we can unpack it. I think there's multiple ways to slice it. Clearly, the violence that is most, sort of closer to our lives is that which is domestic, right? But it's just like right now we're engaged, not we, but the world is engaged in a war of ethnic whites, and that is, and I don't mean to reduce that violence, right? I mean to honor that violence and what it represents, because it represents well, it's actually the same demographic that's perpetuating the violence here, in the US, right?
Yep.
So, so there's that piece, right? So, thank you, Dulce, for that.
Thank you.
Well, one of the things we have not really gotten into,
Thank you, Marion.
the human needs of people. They need enough to eat. They need a place where they can sleep. They need to have a feeling of dignity about them. And when they're deprived, there are problems. And one of the things we need to do is look at fairness about where do they live? Are they able to find a place, or are they redlined? Are they able to get money, borrow money when they need to? Are their children going to be comfortable in school? But so much of the things where people have been deprived and they're trying to work their way up.
Yeah.
I think there's too much of a feeling that there's a pie out there. And if we are equal with other people, we're taking something from ourselves. We are not getting enough for ourselves from that piece of pie that's there. How to somehow or other let people know that there is enough for everybody is really necessary, because we're having a tremendous backlash to this Black Lives Matters.
Yeah, the inability to just sort of share the power, share the wealth, share the cookies, right? Like share, there is a quote by I don't know, somebody don't have to Google it. Power concedes nothing without demand. Power concedes nothing without demand. Who said that? Power concedes nothing without demand. I have to get it looks like, Frederick Douglass. Looks like it's Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without demand. But I also want to, sort of treat, Marion, the seductive quality of power, right? It's so seductive. I see your hand, Ali. It's so seductive. So theoretically and intellectually, like I understand the difficulty of yielding and giving and sharing power. Like I get it. Like I totally get it. I mean, because we enjoy a degree of power depending on the different spaces that we are in, whether it's family, professional, social, right, political. There's some time that we enjoy power. And so it's seductive. What is unfortunate is that we cannot resist the urge to understand the need for some equity or equality for others, right? So then it's not about me, I'm outside of my head and my ability to enjoy power. It's an understanding and an awareness that if others don't have some power, some control, some agency, then they are in a condition, and I'm creating conditions for others that are unfortunate, are sad. To your point about civility and human needs, right? And sort of getting to like the basic level of civility and humanity. I mean, I get this whole seductive thing about power, right? But shame on me, right? Shame on me if I don't understand the critical need for others to enjoy power also. It's an understanding. It's a mental, cognitive need, exercise to understand the need for others to be equitable and to be just and to be fair. It's a cognitive power, or it's a cognitive deficiency when one does not understand that, right? It's a cognitive power or it's a cognitive deficiency. Ali, what you got?
Okay, I want to go back to the Whoopi Goldberg example.
Okay, please.
And I'm going to preface this by saying that this seems to be a reductionist tendency, but a necessary one that in our society we review over and over again. To give an example of what I'm talking about, you know, in response to the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, D.C., you know, that was met with tanks and tear gas, whereas, you know, the January 6th revolt was, you know, met with a few police officers who, you know, got smushed indoors and beaten and stuff like that. And so, you know, and we've often said, well, if the January 6th protesters had been Black,
oh yeah,
the response would have been severe and swift and just 180 degrees different from what we saw. So that's the, you know, the perhaps reductionist, but very real reality that we all go through. So what occurred to me, I wanted to know how you felt as a Black man when Whoopi Goldberg was, you know, basically told to go sit in a corner and think about it after she made this comment, which she wasn't trying to make. Well, maybe I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'd like to hear, but I guess I would just say it. I don't think she was trying to be, you know, rude or impolite or discourteous in any way. I think she was expressing her lived experience. So how did you feel about the network's reaction to her? Do you agree with my assessment? What's your take?
Thank you. Thank you. Ali, I find this whole sort of cancel culture problematic. And by the way, I do, Amy, I see a question in there I want to get to regarding to educational systems and Black students. And so I want to get there. I find this, the idea of cancel culture problematic, right? Because it doesn't allow for intelligent discourse, dialogue, conversation, which is critical for our movement politically, ideologically, educationally. And so if I don't like what someone says, I cancel them or I tell them to sit in the corner, as opposed to the heavier lift, which is an intelligent engagement, right? An opportunity to hear a different perspective, to understand or not understand, to agree or not agree with a different perspective, right? I don't think we get to, Paulo Freire has taught us, it's a Freirean model, that we change our minds or we confirm our positions and perspectives in conversation with others, in dialogue and in discourse with others. So I find the whole cancel culture, go sit in the corner, whether it's Whoopi Goldberg or Dave Chappelle or, I find it problematic because I don't get to engage in the intellectual exercise of learning. So that's my take on I haven't had a TV in 25, we haven't had a TV in 25 years. So like, I'm getting it bits and pieces from the internet and from my news alerts, etc. But I am aware of that controversy. But yeah, I find cancel culture just, we can't think together. I want to be able to think together. Oh, okay, so I got that wrong, or thank you for that enlightenment, or well, my position is this, or my perspective in this is this, and this is why. And that way you understand that what I'm saying or what I'm thinking is not coming from a place of malice, or coming from a place of degradation, or coming from a place of mean-spiritedness. But I may be ignorant, or I may have limited information. Help me. We don't get to that kind of exchange with the cancel culture, or go sit in the corner. So that's my take. Thank you.
Matais, but I don't think that's just about cancel culture.
Okay.
I think that is it's the zeitgeist in our American way. It's what we evolved or devolved into, because how many of us are really having intellectual conversations out in the streets? We're not doing it. We haven't done it for a long time, but especially in the last 4 years or through the Trump administration, we weren't talking to each other. And the other thing that occurs to me when I listen to your question, Ali, your comment and your response, Matais, is that there are certain realities and practicalities. What's really resonated for me today was this short clip of these two young Ukrainian girls entering their new school in an Italian city. And everyone in the school was at the front door applauding for them. And you've heard this cliche. It's wonderful, and I don't want Ukrainians to be rejected anywhere in the world. But that's not what we saw with people from Afghanistan. That's not what we saw with Syrians. It's not what we see with Mexicans at our borders. It's not what we see with, African people from the African continent knocking on our doors. That's not the reception that we get. So the reality is that we have some beliefs, and we have some, maybe you want to call them stereotypes, or some prejudices, and that prevent us from having that dialogue that, yes, as intellectuals and as scholars, perhaps we can engage, but it's really hard. And I haven't seen it happening in the United States for a while.
Yeah.
I don't know if it ever existed.
Yeah. And I sit in a pretty not insular, but as an educator, like you as an educator, our lives daily are about the kind of discourse, dialogue, because we're in a space, a college or a university, where we may take for granted that other persons are not having that. This is what I hear you saying, Dulce, is not everybody has that opportunity, or not everybody's interested in that kind of intellectual conversation. Popular culture doesn't necessarily provide space for that kind of intellectual engagement, right? It's quick, it's TikTok, it's the second, the minute, the day. And that's what I find problematic, the fact that we don't have an opportunity for that engagement and intellectual discourse. I can't learn without exercising that muscle, the mind muscle, the intellectual muscle. And I don't know that, to your point, that everybody's doing that in the popular domain. Popular domain. The question in the chat, I guess I'd like to know what the educational system should be doing to enhance the education of Black students, whom we seem to be failing on various levels. one of the things that comes to mind for me is representation. Faculty ranks in the state of California, particularly at community colleges, are just, I mean, have a paucity of Black faculty in their ranks. I mean, I've worked at 6 community colleges in Northern and Southern California, and I can literally count the number of Black faculty at all 6 colleges. You'd be stunned at how low the number is, you know. And so I think, I mean, I went to a Black college, right? And in my experience at a Black college, there were a parade of Black professionals daily that I saw. They were role models, they were faculty, they were deans, they were administrators, there was a college president, there was a chancellor, and that impressed me, right? That motivated me, that inspired me to see myself reflected in the classroom, in the administrative ranks, right? And consequently, you know, students from HBCUs go on to earn advanced degrees at faster rates and higher percentages than students who attend predominantly white institutions. There is something to the role modeling. There is something to being able to access people who look and feel like you do. Imagine an institution where there's no women, or 1 or 2 women at the college, right? And you don't see yourself reflected in the faculty ranks. You can't go to a woman counselor, right, who will understand all of the ways that you might present in that day or in that moment, right? Or how you might be balancing your life responsibilities, work, transportation, childcare, whatever, right? And so the salient thing that comes to mind for me is representation in the faculty ranks, right? And we got all these initiatives that are great and wonderful, guided pathways, AB 705, like, but nobody wants to hire Black faculty or something. I went, let me walk that back. Black faculty are not hired for whatever reason. Pick a reason, right? Pick one. They're not hired, right? And so they're not in the pool. But when they want some athletes, they magically know how to find that number one foot linebacker, right? They can find that linebacker. But when they want a faculty person of a particular discipline, they're just not in the pipeline. We just don't know where they are, right? And so my thing is to hire Black faculty so that and I think that's a way of impacting student success. And there's multiple ways, but I think that's a way of moving the needle on student success. Instructional and non-instructional. Okay, that's it for me.
All right.
Okay.
So we are coming up on almost 8:30, which is when we wanted to end this. And I'd like to thank Matais for that wonderful discussion. It's not often that we get to just ask candid questions and not feel like, we're being offensive or rude. And so it was a very nice discussion, and we really appreciate that. Of course, if you like this webinar, we have others coming up, and you can connect with the League of Women Voters of Southwest Santa Clara Valley through our Facebook. Yeah, we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and also we have a newsletter if you want to sign up for that. But these are all the ways that you can connect with us. Plus, after this webinar, I will be posting the video to YouTube. So if you want to listen to it again or share the video with your friends, feel free to do that once I provide you with the link. Again, thank you so much for attending the webinar and asking all those wonderful questions. And thank you so much, Matais, for leading the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.